Well, Dan Jackson went to the University of Texas to study law. He first went to Georgetown, Texas, to Baylor for preparatory to law, I think. And his brother Tom had finished in Austin, Texas, there in the university there just before him. Tom had studied medicine, and he became a very brilliant surgeon. Dan worked his way through the University of Texas. One time he worked for a professor, and he did the chores and things like that around this small farm, and anything else that he had to do on a farm like that. And at one time, when he was going to the university, he drove a streetcar for a while. I don't know what all kind of jobs he had, and then he tutored too. But he finished his law degree in 3 years. Well, Dan and Hannah were married in San Antonio, Texas. I have talked about that before. And they lived in Waco for a while. In fact, my older brother, Rudy we call him, was born there. And there seemed to be some kind of a holdup with the doctor, horse and buggy doctor, of course, and no telephones. And so he was coming in on his way before they could get hold of the doctor. So my father delivered his own son. Delivering that baby must have been the easiest part of the whole thing. I understand that my grandmother Lessing was crying and praying in German all the while. She was absolutely helpless when it came to anything like this. Dan and Hannah went to Galveston to live when they left Waco shortly after they were married. And I think at that time that Gunther was still up at Yale. So I believe that my grandmother Lessing came and lived with them. I'm not sure, but I can't imagine an elderly lady like that living alone in those days. It just simply was not done. They lived with one of their children. So I suppose that she went to Galveston with them. And my mother, Hannah, developed a very bad-sounding cough. And so my father worried about that since Rudolph Lessing had died of what they called at the time consumption. Now it's called tuberculosis. He wasn't very old when he died, I don't believe. But since he had weak lungs, my father feared this. So that's the reason why he went to El Paso, where it was high and dry, because of my mother's health. Well, she did well there, and she certainly never had tuberculosis, thank God. My father was always a very public-spirited man and very patriotic in every way. And any way that he could help the city or the state or his country, he was always willing to do. So he was very active in politics there in El Paso. Not to be running all the time, but to help the mayor and the Congress and senators to reach whichever ambition they had. And he was very valuable there at making speeches. And he also, for many years, was sent by the Chamber of Commerce to these different lodge meetings at the Masons and Elks and those kind of people to bring the conventions to El Paso. El Paso really didn't have very much to lure them to that I can see. It was an arid little western town. And before Prohibition, they didn't even have the addition of getting liquor. So I really don't know what brought them there, but I guess my father was a pretty good speaker if he could accomplish that big. I don't mean to say they couldn't get liquor, because liquor was not outlawed in Texas until it was outlawed in the United States. They could get liquor there all right, but during Prohibition they couldn't. And they were very glad to have Juarez, Mexico, right across the border, where there were quite a few what we call nightclubs and restaurants and things like that. And they also had gambling over there that brought the people to that part of the world. I believe my father's first law firm was Jackson and Lee. I know that Tom Lee was also a very young lawyer, and I'm pretty sure that was his first law partner. He was in many firms. There was Jackson, Isaacs, and Lessing, Jackson, Isaacs, Lessing, and Fryer, Jackson, Isaacs, Lessing, and Davis, and different ones that they all seemed to cling, though, after a while, until he went to Washington. I was born in, of course, El Paso, at Hotel Dieu. That was the only hospital there at that time, and it was run by these Catholic nuns, and that's where I was born. When I was about 3 weeks old, this colored woman came to the door one day, and she was so clean and so nice looking, and her personality was so nice, and she was really looking for a job. Well, my mother was really glad to see her, and she just liked her from the very beginning. So she said that her name was Hattie. Well, Hattie came to work for us, and she worked for us until we left there at 17, and then she worked for my brother Rudy on and off for a good many years. And I couldn't very well go along with a family story without bringing Hattie in, because she was just like a member of the family. She taught me many good things, morals, and many good things besides cooking, I can tell you that. And I know she told me never to call any human being black, that she wasn't black, and neither were we white, but you should always call colored people colored, because that's what they were, and it showed you respect them. And there were other names that I would never let cross my lips that they called the colored people. And so to this day I find it very hard for me to call anyone black. Hattie taught me to do the Eagle Rock and the Ball and the Jack. They were colored dances. Those colored people used to do them, and they were a lot of fun to do. But the white people didn't do that kind of dance until many years later, when they did the Charleston and the Black Bottom. Then they started doing that type of dancing, which you stand by yourself, more or less. You don't really need a partner with those dances. When I was around 6 years old and Rudy was about 10, we were living at that time not very far from the border, and they had some kind of an uprising over there. I believe it was a revolution. They had those every now and then, and of course they had lots of bandits like Villa and different ones. I can't remember their names anymore. But so this was some kind of a disturbance over there, and we could hear the shooting at night from our sleeping porch there. And it was pretty scary. And but Papa said that none of the bullets would come that far. They wouldn't reach that far. But anyway, along came Thanksgiving, and we were having guests for dinner, and Rudy had been playing outside. Well, we couldn't find him when it was time for dinner. So I went and looked all over the neighborhood, couldn't find him. So, of course, it just spoiled everything because my mother was so worried and so was my father. So we went on and ate anyway, and here came Rudy about 3 or 4 hours later. And what had happened, some people had a car, some neighbors, and they were going to go over and see the battlefield over there in Juarez, just to see what they could see. And he was playing there, and they asked him if he'd like to come. And of course, kid liked, to ride in an automobile and go over there to the battlefield. Why, sure. So he went with them without telling my parents. This was very much against the rules always. But anyway, he did, and he was gone, I guess, for about 4 hours. So when he came back, my father was really furious. He said he had taken things off of those dead men. Well, he did. He brought some bullets and some kind of belts that they put bullets in that the soldiers had. So those are the kind of things that he brought back. And, of course, I think that all the ammunition was blanks. I don't think that there was any charges in them when he brought them back. But anyway, that was kind of a funny thing to happen. My father was Villa's American lawyer. I don't know. I guess that he had him over here in case there was some destruction or something down in South El Paso where they did have bullets come over. And I remember one time they had an uprising, and there were several people killed right along the border on the American side. So at any rate, he had Villa for a client. And one time my father was in Los Angeles trying a case, and when he went to come back on the train, he took the train there in Los Angeles, and it comes down to Mexicali. And it went just a little bit over the Mexican border there, the train did. I don't know how that happened, whether it was a mistake on the railroad, the way they laid the railroad, or just what it was. But anyway, it was just on the Mexican border. So the train stopped there, and my father got off thinking that he would get a good Mexican meal while the train was waiting there to go and meet the next train or whatever it was supposed to do. Railroads were pretty poor in those days. Anyway, my father was in this Mexican restaurant, and right above his head there was a picture of himself. And in Spanish it said, "Wanted." This man speaks Spanish fluently, but claims he's an American, and he's Villa's attorney. Well, of course, the whole of Mexico was looking for Villa, so they had a wanted sign for my father. Well, he said he didn't know whether to get up and leave, and that would draw attention, or whether just to sit there. And he was really scared. Well, he had already ordered when he noticed it. And he said there was some kind of a player piano there that was playing Dardanella. That was a song that was very popular for quite some time. He said it kept going over and over and over. They kept playing this Dardanella like you hear so often on the jukeboxes. They play the same thing. And he said that he finally got up, he got his hat and paid and left and ran back to the train. So when he came home, of course I didn't know this, what he had been through, but we were talking different what had happened while he was gone and everything. And my mother said that I had been practicing so I could play a little tune for him. And lo and behold, the tune was Dardanella. I started talking to you about Hattie, and I digressed quite a bit. But one time when I was either 2 or 3 years old, I swear I remember this, but people don't think that I could possibly remember it. But anyway, I used to love to go on the streetcar. So Hattie was a great one for taking me in the afternoons on the streetcar. And, of course, she enjoyed it, too. So she had me in one of those little go-karts that you push along with children in it, like a little seat thing. And so we took the streetcar, and we went, and Hattie paid. They had a conductor in the back, in those days, and then the driver was in the front, so the one that watched the cash box was in the back. So anyway, Hattie went up and took a seat in the streetcar, and a little while the conductor came up there and told her that she would have to get back to the Jim Crow seats. And she says, well, I have a white child with me. And he says, well, that's too bad. You're going to have to ride in the Jim Crow anyway. And she said, I won't take this white child into the Jim Crow seats. Her father would like it. And he said, well, that's just too bad. So he picked up the little go-kart and dropped it out of the back window. And so, of course, she got up, and he was so ugly to her, and she was so humiliated. So she got off. So I think we walked back home. Of course, she put me in the little go-kart, and we walked back home. Well, it took us quite a little while then, because we had to walk from the streetcar tracks there, after we had gone quite a little ways before he came up there to throw us off the thing. So my father was home when we got there, and so Hattie told him about it. She was almost in tears. And so he was just so mad. He hit the ceiling, and he went over to the telephone, and he called up the head of the streetcar company there, whoever was the head of it. My father was an attorney for the El Paso Transit Company at the time. And he told him what happened, and he said, and I want that son of a bitch fired. So he said, no, don't put him on another line. He doesn't deserve to run a car in El Paso, and I want him fired. Well, by golly, they did. They fired that man, and he really deserved it. I remember one Christmas we went to Tinnan's ranch. The Tinnans were clients of my father, and he had a big spread there. And so when we came from town, from Van Horn, when we went to the ranch, someone had told Mr. Tinnan that someone was out to kill him. I don't know any more about what it was that Tinnan deserved to be killed, but anyway, that was the word. Well, of course, it was just whispered around, and it wasn't told to the children until later. But quite a few of their friends came over Christmas Eve to dance, and they had a square dance there. They had a fiddler and a banjo player and a caller. So, of course, we children weren't included in any of the grown people's activities, so we were in the bedroom there, but of course we could hear the square dancing going on. And my mother was terribly worried. And she told me later that she was looking out over the prairie every time she would think about it to see if she saw anyone coming. Well, those yucca plants at night look for the world like a man with a big hat on. So that just scared her to death. So she told my father she was so uneasy, she just thought she couldn't stand it there. And he said, don't you know if there was a man going to kill Charlie, he wouldn't be walking out in the desert like that. He'd be hiding behind the house. That's where you look for the man that's not coming anyway. He just made that bluff to make Charlie scared of him, that's all. But that was quite an experience. There was another time we went to Van Horn. We used to go there often, but this particular time they were having a rodeo there in Van Horn. And my friends there, those ranch people, asked us to come and be there and for this big rodeo that was going to last 2 or 3 days. Well, my father didn't want to go for some reason or other, and furthermore, we had relatives. His cousin, Myrtle, was, she had she had been a light opera singer. She was a star in Naughty Marietta, and she had been married for some years to Dr. Harry Fleming, and he was a big diagnostician in New York. Well, he had been sent to diagnose what was wrong with the Indians who were dying on the reservations in New Mexico. So while they were there, they naturally visited my parents in El Paso. So I was nagging my father, and Dr. Fleming said, rodeo, what's that? So Papa told him what a rodeo was, and a barbecue and all that they had there. Just wonderful, wonderful food and real ranch cooking. And then, of course, they had all of these bulldogging and all those things that they have on these rodeos. So he said, well, he would love to go. So Papa said, well, I don't know if you'll like it so much. It's pretty rough down there. It's not like New York, you know. And he said, well, I live in New York. I want to see what they do out here. He was very interested in the West. He was a very enthusiastic man and a very curious person. He wanted to experience everything. So Papa said, all right, we'll go there, and we won't stay with any of those ranch friends. We'll stay at the hotel there. Funnily enough, that was called the Jackson Hotel in Van Horn. So Papa got on the phone and called to see about the reservations, and they said, sure, they could give us 3 rooms. So Papa said, all right, he said, keep those 3 rooms open for us, and we'll be down there in the next couple of days, whenever it was. And so he decided that we would all go on the train, the Flemings and Mom and Papa, and Rudy would take the car, so that we'd have the car down there. He wanted to have his own transportation. You couldn't rent cars in those days, and they weren't all that plentiful at that time. So that's what we did. We went on down there, and we stayed at this old hotel, and it wasn't so old. It was just not very well finished or anything like that. It was just a rough hotel, country and all. So we went down there, and oh boy, it was really some big doings there. They had, I don't know how many of these picnic tables, and they had, about 3 barbecue pits going all the time. Everybody in the whole country was there. So Harry Fleming was just so thrilled with seeing all that he would go right out there where they were having the rodeo, right under those bucking horses and everything, and take their pictures. It's a wonder he didn't get killed. But those ranch people they really liked him, because he was such a tenderfoot and didn't try to be anything but just what he was. He was a charming man. And, of course, my cousin Myrtle, she wasn't so crazy about that rough stuff. It wasn't really new to her, because she came from Texas, too. So anyway, there was a boy, and he was the star, really, in the rodeo. He was a good-looking young kid, about 16, or maybe he was 18. But anyway, he was young, and he could do all that bulldogging and that roping and all that business that they do that's so rough and tough. And so he was crazy to go to Hollywood, because he was such a big star. But his people had a big ranch, and they didn't want any part of show business. Well, anyway, we stayed for the duration of the rodeo. And everyone just had a wonderful time, and there was a lot of hooping it up and carrying on, you know how they do in those Western movies. Well, they don't do it justice, because it's really a lively time. So there was some girl, one of these ranch girls, and she met a young tenderfoot. I think he was a salesman. Anyway, he was from the East, I know that. And he made the mistake of offering her a cigarette. Well, she went and told her brother that this man had offered her a cigarette. So, my goodness, that was an insult to his sister, and he wasn't going to have that. So, they were laying for that fellow. I don't know what they were going to do to him. But Papa got wind of it, and he said, my God, why, they're going to kill that guy. So he got the sheriff, who, of course, was a very good friend of his, and he told him, he said, look, he said, you better arrest him and get him in custody before they tear him to pieces. And so the sheriff was very glad to hear that because, of course, he didn't want some terrible thing like that to happen. So he arrested the fellow and put him in our car, and Rudy drove him to the station and put him on the train to get him out and get him to El Paso and out of the way. And he was very grateful because they were going to run him out of town. That would have been the least they would have done, put him out in that broiling hot desert. And he probably would have died. That was the first day we were there. And the next day, about, late in the afternoon, this was during Prohibition time. There wasn't any booze there except bootleg stuff that was floating around. But the sheriff came by there where we were watching the rodeo, and so Dr. Fleming and my father went off with the sheriff and said they'd be right back. So they went up there to the courthouse. Well, they didn't tell us where they were going, and because they were coming right back. So they didn't come back. And we waited, and then my mother got worried, and everybody was worried because people were breaking up now, and they were getting on home. And here it was getting dark, and it wasn't like my father not to be where we could almost put our hands on him any time. So the chief of police came to say hello to us, and we told him. My mother said, well, I don't know where Dan went, but I'm really worried about him. And he said, maybe he went to the courthouse. Well, Mama said, yes, well, maybe he did. He was with the sheriff and Dr. Fleming. And so he said, I'll find him for you. Don't you worry, Mrs. Jackson. So he did. He went and he found my father and all of them, and they were locked in the safe. They had some liquor in the safe. So the sheriff went there so they could all have a good drink, and while they were in there, somebody accidentally locked the safe door. It was one of those walk-in safes, great big thing. And they had this confiscated booze and all those things that they have in the custody. And so here they were. Well, they were in there a couple of hours, and it wouldn't have been long before they would have died of suffocation. Well, of course, then when the chief of police went there, and he, thank goodness, he looked in the safe, and he let them out. Well, now that was really something to happen to anybody. Well, Harry really got a kick out of it. And Papa thought it was kind of funny, too, but they were all just scared to death. Well, there was another thing that happened there that didn't end so nicely. It was that young boy who was such a star in the rodeo, and his father just told him that to forget show business, and he didn't want to hear any more about it, that he was going to stay there and going to run that ranch. And the boy killed himself. Isn't that tragic? Well, when the Flemings went back to New York, Harry was talking to a big theatrical producer. He was one of his clients. His name was Tex Rickard, and he was very well known all over Western Star. And he suggested to him that he have the rodeo come to New York. And an upshot of that was they had the first rodeo there in the gardens where the rodeo took place. And Myrtle, as I said before, was the star in Naughty Marietta. And that was a Victor Herbert play. He wrote many, many lovely operettas. And Myrtle had a sister named Winona. And she was in a play on Broadway there with Al Jolson. Both of those girls were, that wasn't just a single shot with them. They were pretty big stars in those days on Broadway. That Jolson play was a Ziegfeld production. I find that I didn't record the first part of this tape, somehow or other didn't record, but that was Madison Square Gardens in New York where the rodeo played. My family were very fond of traveling, and we used to go on trips, real camping trips, where we would sleep under the stars at night. We wouldn't think of using a tent. That would be too much like a tenderfoot. And so we would just camp right out there in the prairie, and of course we would usually try to find some trees if there were any to find, and try to find a little water. And we also camped all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, where we used to go down there at Corpus Christi and over in Padre Island. That was real wild country in those days, but these people had very nice little cottages that they rented out. And my Uncle Tom and Aunt Mamie used to rent one, and they brought their own colored servant. And we used to take Hattie, and we had our own little cottage. And they went there and they did deep sea fishing, and they would go out and wade out in the surf and get red snapper. And, they had wonderful times. I was a little too young for the fishing business, but Rudy was old enough, and he was pretty handy to have around because he could run those boats that they always hired a boat with the man who owned it would run it. But Rudy was very good there and baiting their hooks and all like that. He was a handy kid to have around. But we all loved that camping out, that part of it, because we always felt like we were just like the pioneers that were coming across the desert. And at night, Papa used to tell us such wonderful stories about the pioneers and how they would eat prairie dogs and just the terrible things that happened to them when the desperados came there and the Indians and all. And I think he always did that with the idea of letting us know just how the West was won. We used to build our fires right there on the desert and cook just like the pioneers did. And we used, if we didn't have any wood, why we would get cow chips. You see, that was cattle country, and they burned very well. And so Papa was a good camp cook, and of course Hattie was good at it too. But we only took her on that way one time, because Hattie was deathly afraid of snakes. She would almost go into a spasm if she even thought about a snake. So she would sleep in the car. But we would sleep out on the ground, on some blankets and everything, and Papa used to put ropes around our pallets there to keep the snakes from crawling into camp there. That will keep them from doing so. And but Hattie couldn't stand it, so Papa said he wasn't going to put her through that anymore. And so she actually only went that time, and then some years later, when we drove from Los Angeles to San Francisco. But the Jackson boys liked to get together, and they came from their respective towns. Uncle Tom, of course, was San Antonio, and Uncle Charlie, I don't know what town in Texas. I don't believe it was Eddie. I really don't know what town he came from. But he and his wife came once or twice there, and it gave the Jackson boys a good chance to just be with each other for a week or two, and they really did have a great time. And Hattie was really such a great cook. She really could, as she used to say, her husband's name was Jim Shiner. And she used to say, I could cook Jim Shiner if I had to. And you know, she really could. He would have been good if she cooked him. On one of those trips, we stopped in the next county from El Paso, going east. And it was the Devil's River there. And it was a nice big oasis there in the prairie. And it was a beautiful place to be. And so we had run into the sheriff of El Paso, who was there with his cousin, another man. He wasn't very strong, but he was a lovely man. And I know he used to kill the squirrels. And boy, I had never had squirrel before, but they were really delicious. And we were on the Devil's River, and the water was so clear that the fish would see us there and they wouldn't bite. Now that's really true. So my father used to fire his gun over the water there, and it would stun the fish, and Rudy would dive in there and bring the fish in. Isn't that funny? At that time you could drive along the highway there, and Texas boasted of having the best roads in the country. And they really were wonderful roads because they didn't get washed out. They didn't have that much rain there in the prairie. And they had such a solid road bed that they had wonderful roads. But you could drive along for an hour sometime without meeting another car at that time. Cars weren't that plentiful in Texas at any rate. We used to use the train frequently, too. I know that when we went out to, we came out here to Los Angeles, and we went to Long Beach eventually. We went to Long Beach and rented a house there in Long Beach. And my father let Hattie come on the train with my sister Dan, who was only about 6 months old, and he didn't want her traveling in the car like that. So my mother and my brother Rudy and Papa and I drove out in our Hudson to Los Angeles. And so we used to go to Venice. At that time it was just like an amusement park. That's what it was, an amusement park. And they also had a very good amusement park there in Long Beach. There was a wonderful race through the clouds, they used to call it, something like that. That dipped down over the ocean, you know. It would leave the tracks, and oh boy, that was a lot of fun. And Rudy and I used to take Hattie to Venice, and they had the whip and all those kind of things, and she was scared to death of them. But she would get on them. We would coax her to get on them, and then she'd say, I was so scared I just turned white. We had a lot of fun with her, and she really liked it. But my mother and father made quite a few trips on the train. They went to New York, and one time they went to New Orleans, and one time my Uncle Tom and Aunt Mamie came out to El Paso, and from El Paso, this was on the train, they picked up Mama and Papa, and they went to British Columbia, and the four of them had a lovely time. That wasn't a children's vacation. And so they left us with Hattie. And, Hattie was just a lot of fun. We just loved for them to go on these trips and leave us with Hattie because, we used to dance all over the place and make a lot of noise in the house and things that my parents wouldn't have put up with, you know. And Hattie would do all this kind of dancing, and she sang awfully well. And we just had a circus there when Mama and Papa were off on their trips, and they never had to bother at all. And when they came back, the news was good because we were very happy there with Hattie and whoever her husband was. She had about 3 different husbands. Her first husband I don't know if he was actually her husband, but when she left San Antonio, she ran away with this colored man who was in the minstrel show. And so they got as far as El Paso, and the minstrel folded. They didn't have a big enough audience, and so they just went broke there. And so here Hattie was in a strange town, and she wasn't all that old then. I suppose she was about 18 or 19. And that was when she went out looking for a job and knocked on my mother's door. But she could have been in the minstrel herself. She could sing well enough, and she certainly could dance, and she had a darling personality. But anyway, that's how Hattie happened to be there. Well, then she had another husband whose name was Luther, and Luther died. He had tuberculosis, and he died. And but they lived there on the place. We had the servants' quarters in the back, and they lived on the place there. And this fellow Luther, he was just crazy about Papa. And so he used to do the yard and the heavy cleaning and things like that. And Hattie did the cooking by that time, because she wouldn't cook and take care of children at the same time. So she was such a good cook. Why, my mother got Mexican girls very often to take care of me and the smaller children as they came along. I must tell you more about that beach there at Padre Island. It's the most beautiful beach I've ever seen. The water there is quite warm because the Gulf Stream comes through there. And the ocean is really wild, and they have these beautiful breakers that come in there. We used to jump those waves, and it was really great. So much different to the Pacific. And blue as blue could be. Well, they would go there and fish for red snapper. And when they would go on one of those all-day fishing trips, they used to go back from the water quite a ways and dig a well for water. Well, the water wasn't salty, but it was brackish and not very good, but it would keep you from really thirsting to death. And every time they used to dig one of those wells, they were talking about how they were going to find the treasure that Lafitte, the pirate who was so well thought of there in New Orleans, and how he and his gang had been on that island and lived there for a while and had buried their treasure. Well, of course, my brother Rudy, he was going to be the one to find it. Well, he didn't find it, but the Currys did. That was this Mr. Curry. He was the one who had the boat that took us out fishing, and he and his 3 boys, they were in their early 20s, and they used to supply fish for over there in Corpus Christi. Well, this one day they went out red fishing, red snapper, and by golly, if they didn't find that treasure. Well, of course, they just couldn't believe their eyes, but it was quite a bit of treasure. It was a great big treasure chest or some kind of a box or container. And they had only their little jalopy, and it wasn't equipped to carry anything in except just the 3 men and probably some fish. And so they put rope around their ankles and their wrists and filled up with as much treasure as they could possibly do it. And they had to walk back to town. Well, that was quite a ways with that heavy treasure on them. Well, of course, when they got back to town, everybody just simply went wild. And it really happened. They found that treasure. Well, they went back the next day, or as soon as they could, and they had staked it off somehow, thinking that maybe they could find it again. But, of course, the surf had come up there and washed away any markings that they could possibly find. And they say that Mr. Curry went completely wild. He went insane. Every day of his life he went back looking for that treasure. Also, there's something interesting there, that Franklin Roosevelt went down there to fish for a tarpon. And to catch a tarpon, you have to be a good fisherman, because they're a game fish.
And I don't think I've never heard of anyone eating them. But you have to be a good fisherman. And I know my brother Rudy, he was a good enough fisherman. When he was 15, he brought one in. Of course, it wasn't one of the great big ones, but he caught one anyway. And Roosevelt was crazy about it down there. I don't know if he ever caught one of those or not, but he really put that place on the map. Just in this last year, there has been an oil spill. I think there's an oil well that's owned by the Mexican government out there in the Gulf. And this oil they couldn't cap this well somehow, and all of this terrible oil has come up there on that beautiful beach. And I don't know, for a while they said it was spoiled, and now they say that it isn't so bad after all, that they have some way of picking that oil up.
My sister Dan was born in 1916, and they named her Dan, having expected a boy, but I had wanted them to name her Terrell. But I was so thrilled that she turned out to be a girl, and she was a cute little thing. And everybody was just as glad that she was a girl after all. It was about this time that they were talking about the war over in Germany. The Germans had invaded Belgium, and Franz Joseph had been assassinated, and so that started that war. And they were attacking France also, and there was so much talk about it. But of course, being a child, and at that time I didn't dream that we would ever be in the war ourselves. But my mother was very much against Germany for having done these desperate things to these other smaller countries, weaker countries. And she said those German officers were very arrogant and very cruel. And she thought it would be a cruel and bloody war, and of course it really was. Well, then we went into the war in 1917, which was about a year after my sister was born. And I know that the children were just as interested in that war as the adults. And we used to give plays at school in order to raise money for war bonds. And we danced and we sang and we did all those things that children do in little plays. And then they had a way of fixing Mexican lunches in El Paso itself. And people would go in there, and they made a lot of money on those Mexican lunches. And I remember one of those, I played the violin. And I played La Golondrina and the Rosary. I never did become an accomplished violinist, but I did get that much out of it. Everything was aimed at getting money for war bonds. And I know my mother and father took my mother's diamonds, all but one, and sold them in order to buy war bonds. People really went out and did things like that, just like they did during the Civil War. They took any valuables and sold them in order to put the money to good use in the war effort. They had these rallies out in the park and at schools and things like that, where the people used to get up and make speeches about the bonds. And my father made many speeches for the bonds, and then the people would start shelling in the money. They were really patriotic people. And we used to have lots of parades there. You know, Fort Bliss is right outside of El Paso. And they used to have these parades with all the servicemen were in them. And they didn't have floats and things like that. They just had the marching and the bands and the flags flying. And it was the most thrilling thing in the world to see our boys in uniform marching so beautifully. And I remember how it affected me, and I suppose it did everyone else, that I can't see the flag or hear the Star-Spangled Banner, that I don't really want to weep. We had to save on coffee, and we used to save the bacon fat for making soap. They made soap with bacon fat and lye somehow or other. And you see, we didn't have detergents in those days. And the people used to save those, and then they would take them to some collecting place in town. And we would, in order to save on the coffee, would use the grounds 3 or 4 times. So that was one thing that we did. Now, I don't remember rationing of food in the First World War. We did in the Second World War, but not in the First, I'm sure. But my father joined the Army, and he was commissioned a captain in the Judge Advocate General's Department, and he was ordered to go to Washington. Well, by that time, my mother was pregnant with my brother Tommy, and so anyway, he went up to Washington and rented a lovely house for us there. And so here we went, Rudy and Mama and my little sister Danny. And we went on this train. It took us 4 days of slow travel. It was a miserable trip. And Rudy was so good. He was about 16 or 18 at that time. And he was so good to my mother, and we just treated her as though she was going to break. We were so afraid something would happen to her on that trip. But we were up there about 3 months, and during that time, they had a race riot, which was in the next block from where we lived. And I know all women and children had to be off the streets at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Well, we didn't hear anything about it in the papers from Texas, but there was a lot about it there in Washington, D.C. But I don't think it lasted very long, and I don't remember anything terrible happening there. But we were very happy there, and I used to listen to the colored church that we could hear in our home there, where we were living. And the beautiful spirituals. So I always think of those days in connection with those spirituals. They were really beautiful. Well, after about 3 months, my father was selected to go into Mexico as a legal advisor for the some sort of a committee that the president was interested in. So he went down there with several senators and whatnot, but he couldn't be a member of the armed services and do that because it would look too much as though they were taking the soldiers down there. So he got his honorable discharge in a lesser time than he had enlisted for. So they went down there and to see what was happening there in Mexico. They were having many uprisings and revolutions and things like that. And of course, in the meantime, Pancho Villa was doing his darndest around there. And I know one thing that he did, that this was Pancho Villa. He went into Deming, New Mexico, which is just across the border from Mexico. But he went in there and just shot the town up. And there was one little girl about 17 years old, and she worked for the telephone company there. And she was, everybody just flew out of town, just left any way they could get out, but that little girl. And she stayed there and called Fort Bliss. She was smart enough to do that. So they sent the soldiers there and ran Villa out. Of course, my father wasn't his attorney at that time and hadn't been. They had hearings on that uprising there in Deming, which is about 150 miles from El Paso. And they had hearings on that uprising, and they had one boy who was about 16 years old who had lost his leg when Villa came across Mexico. He gathered up all the men on these farms and made them serve with him, and just brought them on up there with them, whether they wanted to come or not. Well, this boy and his father were in Villa's army, although they reluctantly went. And the boy's leg was shot off, and his father was killed in that battle into Deming. And so this boy was a very good witness. He had a good knowledge of English. I don't know where he had gotten that. But anyway, he was a nice-looking boy, and he was such a good witness that my father hired him, and he came and worked on our ranch when we lived there after the war. His name was Jesus, which means Jesus in English. I should mention here that my father had attained the rank of major before he was separated from the service. And I also remember that we had meatless days, and we couldn't have butter. We used margarine. And at that time, they didn't have any coloring in it. It was just white, just like Crisco. It was terrible. Well, while all of this was going on, my uncle Tom was the doctor had joined the Surgeon General's office, and I think that he was a captain or a major in that. I'm not sure which, but he had joined up. And then my uncle Gunther, he joined up, and he refused a commission. He went in as a private in the artillery, but he wasn't in it very long before all of a sudden he was a captain. He was such a brilliant fellow and so well educated. He rose very rapidly. During this time, the women were doing a great deal of knitting of socks and what they used to call beanies, but now they call them ski masks. They were very hard to make, and my mother was one of those few in El Paso who knew how to make them. She learned that over in Germany. And we rolled bandages and things like that to send to the front. The women were really at it, just like the men. And when the troop trains came through El Paso there, and at every other station all along the way, all over the United States, the women would be out there at dawn or even earlier and late at night with these donuts and coffee, so that when the young men got off the train to rest and stretch their legs, they could have some coffee and donuts. And when we saw the different boys going off, everybody would go down to the station and have bands and wave them goodbye. And of course there was much weeping and many tears were shed. But everyone was in good spirits, and the morale was high. They used to call those recruits doughboys, and I've never heard an explanation of why they called them doughboys. And I'm just beginning to wonder if it didn't have some reference to the donuts that the women served them.